Malik Carter adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit as the elevator ascended to the 42nd floor of Harrington and Royce, one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms. The mirrored walls reflected a man polished to jawline, silk tie knotted just right, and eyes that held the cool fire of ambition. Today, he would be presenting a multi-million-dollar restructuring plan to a major tech client, a defining moment in a career built brick by brick on relentless discipline. As the elevator doors slid open to the glass-walled boardroom, Malik strode forward with practiced poise, nodding curtly to the junior associates scrambling in his wake. Outside the building, June Carter dragged a heavy trash bin across the loading dock, her janitorial uniform damp with sweat from the Georgia humidity. She wiped her brow with a paper towel, wincing as she straightened her back. The sun had just begun to climb, and the city glinted like gold above her, indifferent and unreachable. She paused at the side entrance, glancing up toward the windows. Above windows she'd cleaned hundreds of times, never imagining her son would one day work behind them. Just then, Malik stepped through the revolving doors, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. His jaw tightened. He gave no nod, no word, not even a flicker of recognition. Then he walked past her as if she were invisible. One of the junior associates slowed, confused. "Was that?" she began. "No," Malik said sharply, not looking back. "Just someone who works here." Later that morning, after Malik's presentation received a round of approving nods from the client and a satisfied slap on the back from the senior partner, the mood in the boardroom turned celebratory. Glasses of sparkling water clinked, laughter floated, and then his boss, a portly man with silver temples and a toothy grin, leaned in with a smirk. "You know," he chuckled, "the cleaning lady downstairs. Swear to God, she's been here longer than I have. Looks a little like you, come to think of it. You two related." Malik's smile evaporated. His tone turned cold, precise. "That woman's not my family." The laughter faltered, replaced by a nervous shuffle of glances. The moment passed, but the air had changed. Far below, June stood by a service exit, peering up toward the windows. She hadn't heard the words, but she'd seen enough. Her hands clutched the handle of the trash bin until her knuckles whitened. 1,000 memories welled in her eyes: late-night bus rides from work, cold dinners left on the stove, lullabies hummed in the dark. She watched the building that now held her son, her heart aching in the silence. She didn't cry. She just stood there, unseen and unwavering, as the city roared around her. Malik Carter had sculpted himself into a man the world respected, a man who walked through glass towers and command rooms without looking back. To outsiders, he was the embodiment of triumph, a corporate attorney with a corner office in Buckhead, a BMW with tinted windows, and a wardrobe that whispered old money. What they didn't see were the shadows trailing him, a boy who once slept on a couch beside his mother's bed, listening to the hum of the fridge and the drip of the leaky bathroom faucet. June Carter had raised him in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the South Side, where every dollar stretched thin and every choice had weight. She worked double shifts cleaning hotel rooms by day, slinging hash browns at a 24-hour diner by night just to keep him enrolled in the magnet school uptown. He remembered her coming home with tired feet and a proud smile, holding his report cards like trophies. But he also remembered the pitying glances of wealthier classmates, the way their mothers smelled of perfume instead of bleach. The shame rooted itself deep. When he was 15, that shame hardened. One afternoon, visiting a friend's house, Malik had walked in to find his mother on her knees, scrubbing the tiled bathroom floor, her back turned, humming softly, unaware of his presence until it was too late. The other boy's mum had looked away, embarrassed. Malik had stared at her, burning with something close to fury. That night, he exploded. "You'll never be anything more than a maid," he spat, venom lacing his voice. June had stared at him, eyes glistening with quiet pain, but said nothing. She simply turned away, retreating into her room, and closed the door. He never apologized. Instead, he made himself a vow. He would never be poor again, and he would never be seen through her shadow. Years later, that promise had taken root and bloomed. Malik changed his speech, shed his accent, stopped visiting the old neighborhood. He stopped mentioning his mother altogether. In his polished narrative, she had died young, lost to illness or circumstance never quite specified. When he sent money, it was always through Aunt Ruth, June's older sister, who worked long shifts as a nurse and was one of the few people from his past he still answered calls from. Ruth never challenged the story he told the world, but she never stopped reminding him of the truth. "Your mama's not well, Malik," she would say, her voice steady but soft. "You ought to come see her. She don't say it, but she misses you." Malik would thank her, promise to think about it, then hang up before guilt had time to find a foothold. June, for her part, never asked for more. She wore her son's success like a secret medal, tucked close to her chest. Her co-workers didn't know she had a lawyer son, let alone one whose face sometimes appeared in the Atlanta Business Chronicle. She watched his life unfold from a distance, proud but aching. On Sundays, she'd sit with Aunt Ruth after church, sipping tea with hands that trembled a little more each year. "He's busy," she'd say, when Ruth pressed her. "He's important now. That's all I ever wanted." Jared, Malik's childhood best friend, still lived on the same block they'd grown up on. He worked at an auto shop, kept a photo of them as kids, grinning in oversized t-shirts taped to his toolbox. Occasionally, he'd send Malik texts that went unanswered. They were from different worlds now, and Jared had long accepted that. But whenever he saw June on the bus or walking home from work, he'd nod and smile, ask if she needed anything. She'd smile back, too tired to talk, too proud to ask. What none of them knew, what even Aunt Ruth didn't know, was the weight June had carried alone all those years. The secret buried beneath Malik's anger, beneath her silence, a truth that had shaped everything and yet remained locked in her heart, unspoken. As her health faltered, breathing slower, fatigue settling into her bones, June began writing things down. Letters she never sent, names she never said aloud. In the quiet of her apartment, with the television murmuring in the background, she would fold each note and tuck it away in a worn box at the top of her closet, as if preparing for a reckoning she no longer had the strength to face. The Harrington and Roy's partner gala shimmered with opulence crystal chandeliers, a jazz quartet playing softly in the corner, and a sea of finely tailored suits and floor-length gowns. Caleb Carter stood at the center of it all, poised and beaming, the youngest rising star in the firm, ready to propose to his girlfriend Brianna, the daughter of a prominent judge and every bit the image of elegance. Waiters drifted past with champagne flutes as the crowd buzzed, unaware of the ticking moment Caleb had orchestrated for weeks. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the grand hall, Lorna, assigned to clean the venue after the celebration, moved quietly along the edges, unnoticed. She'd watched events like this before, from the background, broom in hand, never as a guest. Tonight, she had lingered longer than usual, drawn by the sound of her son's laughter, the sight of his smile. At the crescendo of the evening, a hush fell. Caleb dropped to one knee in the spotlight, ring box open, and gasps erupted as Brianna placed her manicured hands over her mouth. Phones lit up like stars, flashing wildly to capture the moment. From the back of the room, Lorna's breath caught. In her throat, her son, her boy, was proposing in a room she'd soon be sweeping. As she turned to leave before anyone could notice her, her legs buckled. She collapsed with a hard thud against the polished marble floor, her mop clattering beside her. At first, no one noticed. Then a cry rang out, shocked, sharp from a young intern who had recognized her from the cleaning staff. "It's your mum," he shouted, pointing toward the unconscious woman. "That's Caleb's mother." The room fell into stunned silence. Caleb remained frozen, still kneeling, eyes locked on the woman sprawled on the ground. Murmurs rippled. Cameras dropped. Brianna turned toward him slowly, horror crawling across her face. "That woman, ... she's your maid," she hissed. "Your mother." The disgust in her voice was louder than the music had ever been. Caleb couldn't speak. He felt as though the walls were closing in, the air sucked from the room. Someone called for an ambulance. People began recording. A senior partner slipped away from the crowd. The headline was written before morning. "Elite lawyer disowns his mother, collapsed at his gala." Later, outside the ballroom, Brianna shoved the engagement ring back into his hand, trembling with rage. "You lied to me. You lied about everything. I can't marry someone who comes from that and hides it." She walked away without waiting for a response. Caleb didn't follow. He just stood there. A man gutted his perfect world, unraveling in a matter of minutes. Exposed not just by a fall, but by years of denial that had come crashing down with his mother's body on a marble floor. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway buzzed faintly as Caleb stood outside the ICU room, hands clenched in his pockets, shoulders rigid. He hadn't slept in days. The fallout from the gala had spiraled into chaos articles, headlines, think pieces dissecting his fall from grace. Overnight, he had become a symbol of everything cold and wrong with ambition. Clients dropped him. His firm, scrambling to preserve its image, asked him to step away for a while. He hadn't even fought it. Now, standing outside his mother's room for the first time in years, he felt stripped bare. Through the small glass pane, he could see her, thinner than he remembered, small against the white sheets, an oxygen tube trailing beneath her nose. Machines beeped steadily beside her, indifferent to the ache in his chest. When he finally pushed the door open, it creaked softly. She turned her head, eyes barely open, and when she saw him, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. "You don't have to stay," Lorna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I stopped being your mother a long time ago." Her words weren't bitter, just tired, like someone stating a fact too old to argue. Caleb stood frozen, the air thick between them. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. The last time they'd spoken, years ago, had ended with him shouting in the middle of a street downtown. Her eyes red from pleading, her hands gripping a brown paper bag of groceries. He had called her a burden. He remembered the word, like a slap. She had flinched, and then he had turned and walked away. He hadn't looked back. Now, she lay in front of him, her breaths shallow, her presence shrinking by the hour. The doctors weren't optimistic. Her lungs were weak, her heart strained, and years of untreated stress had left her fragile. After a few silent minutes, Caleb left without a word, unable to face what he'd broken. He went back to her apartment. He had the key, given to him long ago, though he never used it, and stepped inside a life that had gone untouched by luxury. The place was small, faded, and smelled faintly of lemon, cleaner, and thyme. Her shoes were neatly lined near the door, and on the kitchen table sat a half-eaten apple, browned at the edges. Everything was quiet, too quiet. He moved slowly through the apartment, unsure of what he was looking for. In the corner of the closet, beneath a stack of old linens, he found them boxes, carefully labeled in her careful, looping handwriting. Asterisk, Caleb, high school, Caleb, college letters, bills, asterisk. He sat on the floor and opened them, one by one. Inside were letters from universities, some of them opened, some sealed. He saw his own name typed neatly at the top of acceptance letters. Harvard, Stanford. Howard Dan realized she had applied to schools on his behalf, forging essays when he was too tired or disinterested to care. There were rejection letters from scholarships he never knew existed, and beside them, receipts, community college fees, textbook orders, lab fees, all paid out of pocket. Tucked between them was a worn medical bill with the words "payment deferred" scrawled across it. He stared at it, gut twisting. The bill was dated just before his senior year, when he had asked her for 2 new textbooks and a debate suit. She had smiled and said she'd take care of it. She hadn't told him she had skipped medication to do it. Caleb's hands trembled as he reached for another folder, pulling out crumpled notes, handwritten letters addressed to no one. Pages where she'd written down job schedules, grocery lists, reminders, pick up Caleb's shoes from repair, call Ruth about school photos. There were love notes in the margin, short, shaky sentences that made his throat close. "He's so smart. I just want him to have better. Don't let him see you cry. It's worth it. He's worth it." At the bottom of one of the boxes, he found a photo, old, the corners curled. In it, a young version of himself stood in a schoolyard, gap-toothed and beaming, holding up a homemade sign. "My mum is my hero." On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "For Caleb, so he never forgets why I worked this hard." He stared at it for a long time. The silence of the apartment pressed against his chest, but inside him, something else cracked wide open. All these years, he had told himself he became who he was, in spite of where he came from. But looking through those boxes, through the sacrifices, etched into every piece of paper, every missed meal and unpaid bill, he realized the truth. He became who he was because of her. Tears came then, sudden and hot, carving through the mask he'd worn for years. He sat there in the middle of that tiny apartment, surrounded by the quiet echoes of a woman the world had overlooked and he had discarded. And he wept not just for her, but for the boy who had forgotten, and the man who had tried to erase. Where he came from, Caleb stood in the marble foyer of the Stanford estate, the kind of place that whispered generational wealth through every gilded frame and polished surface. Mrs. Stanford, poised and regal despite the years etched into her face, regarded him with a wary curiosity as he sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet chair. "You wanted to talk about Lorna," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something heavier regret. "Maybe." Caleb nodded, unsure how to begin. "She worked for your family when I was a kid. I didn't really know anything about her." Mrs. Stanford sighed and rose slowly, walking to a cabinet where she poured 2 glasses of water. "Your mother was more than a maid," she said, her tone sharpening. "She was one of the most brilliant women I ever met." Caleb blinked, taken aback. The older woman set the glass in front of him and sat down again. "Lorna had a full scholarship to Emory Law," she said simply. "Top of her class, even before she got there. But then, your father, well, he left her, didn't he? And she had you. No family to lean on, just a baby and a future she had to give up." Caleb's throat went dry. He had never heard any of this. Not from his mother, not from anyone. "She came to work for us shortly after," Mrs. Stanford continued. "Told us she needed a job that would let her keep you close. So she pretended to be our live-in maid. That way you could grow up near the better schools. She wore the uniform because it gave her access. But that woman was no servant in spirit." Caleb stared at her, heart thudding as pieces of his mother's quiet sacrifices came into focus like a jigsaw puzzle he never knew existed. "My husband was a lawyer," Mrs. Stanford went on, eyes distant now. "During long nights prepping for court, I often found your mother in the study correcting citations, refining arguments, sometimes even drafting parts of his briefs. She never asked for credit, never wanted it, but I knew she had a mind sharper than most men in that firm. She could have been anything, Caleb, but she chose to be your mother instead." It hit him then, all at once, the years he had spent scrubbing his life clean of her presence, of her story. how he had rewritten his past to suit a future she had built with her own 2 hands. All this time, he'd carried her as a burden in his mind, never realizing she was the very foundation of everything he had become. He left the Stanford estate in a daze, barely remembering the drive back to the hospital. The city blurred around him, every traffic light a pulse in his chest, every face a reminder of the dignity she had quietly borne for decades. When he arrived at the hospital, the nurse gave him a soft, regretful look. "She's unresponsive," she said gently, "but she can still hear you." Caleb pushed open the door to her room, the same sterile light humming overhead, the machines still blinking in quiet rhythm. He approached her bedside slowly, the weight in his chest now unbearable. Her face looked smaller, almost childlike, against the white pillow. He took her hand, trembling. "Mum," he said, voice cracking, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I spent my whole life trying to outrun where we came from. But you were. Never the shame, I was." His voice broke fully then, the sobs rising in his throat as years of guilt and blindness poured out. "You gave up everything. You gave me everything. And I hated you for it, because I was too small to understand. I didn't want to see it, but I do now. I see you, and I'm so proud to be your son." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the machines, the slow in-and of her breathing. Then, faintly, her fingers twitched against his, her eyelids fluttered, and in the barest whisper, so quiet he almost thought he imagined it, she murmured, "You were always my pride." Caleb buried his face into the blankets at her side, holding on to the only truth that mattered anymore. Lorna passed away just before sunrise, her hand still clasped in Caleb's, her breath slipping quietly into stillness as the light outside softened into dawn. There were no final words, no dramatic last glance, solely the quiet peace of a woman who had given everything and asked for nothing. Caleb sat with her long after the machine stopped, his head bowed, her hand cradled in his. For the first time in his life, he allowed the silence to wash over him, not with guilt, but with reverence. He would carry her story now, the true one. He arranged every detail of the funeral himself, no assistants, no PR handlers. The service was held in a modest church in her neighborhood, with sunlight streaming through stained glass and gospel humming in the air. He invited everyone from the law firm, from the partners to the interns, and stood at the front of the room in a simple black suit, no designer labels, no polished pretense. When he stepped up to speak, his voice carried clear and unwavering. "You may have known her as the woman who cleaned your offices," he began, scanning the faces of former colleagues. "But she was the woman who built my future. She wasn't my shame, she was my savior." The speech was recorded by someone in the back pew, and by the next morning, the clip had gone viral. Social media exploded with posts and comments. The maid who raised a lawyer. She gave up law school for her son. He gave her a legacy. Hashtags flooded timelines. Articles were written, and strangers shared their own stories of invisible mothers and unrecognized sacrifice. But Caleb didn't care about the noise. What mattered was that the world finally saw her, the whole of her, in the weeks that followed. He announced the launch of the Lorna Carter Foundation, dedicated to supporting working-class women pursuing education and professional dreams long deferred. The foundation offered scholarships, legal support, and childcare services for single mothers chasing second chances. Caleb funded it himself, liquidating half his assets and stepping away from Harrington and Royce without fanfare. He didn't need the corner office anymore. He opened a modest legal aid office in the same South Side neighborhood where he'd grown up, just a block from the bus stop where Lorna used to wait after long shifts. The walls of the small space were painted warm and bright, and in the lobby, above the reception desk, hung a single framed photo him, age 7, holding a crayon-colored sign that read, "My mum is my hero." Clients came through the door, daily mothers, grandmothers, teenagers with dreams their bank accounts couldn't yet afford. And each time he walked into that lobby, Caleb would look up at that photo and remember, not the shame, not the lies, but the strength of a woman who knelt in silence for years so her son could stand tall. Now it was his turn to kneel, to serve, to build, to honor. And he did, not out of guilt, but out of love. Months later, on a quiet afternoon at the community legal clinic, a young girl walked in hand with her mother, a woman still in her cleaning uniform, dust clinging to the knees of her pants. The girl's eyes were bright, wide with curiosity as she looked around the office, absorbing every book, every diploma, every framed legal document like they were treasures. Her mother, nervous, explained that she needed help with a landlord issue, but it was the daughter who caught Caleb's attention. She clutched a folder filled with scribbled drawings of courtrooms and lawyer Barbie sketches. She wants to be an attorney one day, the mother said softly, almost apologetically. Caleb knelt beside the girl, looking into eyes that reminded him of his own, once full of hope and longing for a future just out of reach. You already have everything you need, he said with a quiet smile. Trust me. As they left, he lingered by the front, watching the girl wave at him through the glass before disappearing down the street. Caleb turned and walked slowly back into his office. He passed the bronze plaque mounted just beside the door, polished and gleaming in the sunlight, the Lorna Moore Foundation for Women Who Sacrifice Everything. He paused, brushed his fingers over the engraved letters, and took a breath. In the soft, reflective silence, his voice echoed in memory, not to anyone else, but to himself. I thought I became a man when I put on a suit. I was wrong. I became a man when I admitted who made me, and with that truth carried close to his heart. Caleb stepped into his office, not just a lawyer now, but a son finally worthy of the name.